Hi, I'm Gail Sokol, and on today's show, we're going to be discussing caramel part 2.
Welcome to Baking Radio. Learn the art and science of baking with author, educator, and award-winning chef, Gail Sokol. Whether you've been baking your whole life or you're brand new to the world of baking and you're looking to build your confidence and learn new skills in the kitchen, you're in the right place. This is Baking Radio.
So on today's show, we're going to be discussing going into the actual process of caramelization, and I'm even going to give you a fabulous caramel sauce recipe that's super simple. So on one of my previous shows, I discussed caramel part 1, and we went into the actual chemistry of caramelization and what it means and how to prevent crystallization so we don't get a gritty caramel sauce. So let's talk about the actual process of caramelization. There are actually 2 ways to do it. One's trickier than another. I've done both ways, and I do recommend one method over the other, and I'll let you know about which one. So the first method is known as the dry method. This is the tricky one. So in this method, you're basically taking sugar dry and putting it into a pan, whether it's a skillet or whether it's a saucepan. And you only put in a tiny little bit of lemon juice to cause inversion to occur. Remember, we talked about that on a previous show, Caramel Part 1, where the lemon juice will actually break down the sucrose into its 2 component monosaccharides, glucose and fructose, so that no crystallization will occur. The only problem with the dry method, where you're just basically heating sugar over the stove, it can get hot spots underneath. And sometimes the burners are not evenly heating the pans, and you can actually burn your sugar very, very quickly. So I prefer that, you can do it the dry method. I find the wet method's a little more forgiving. And if you are a beginner caramel maker, do the wet method first before you even attempt the dry method. So the second method is the wet method, the opposite of dry. I should have said that first. So in this method, granulated sugar and water is combined. And it's not a lot of water. So for 1 cup of sugar, you may have half a cup of water, a third of a cup of water. Recipes vary. And it's combined in a heavy bottomed saucepan. And you want it to be a heavy bottomed saucepan and cooked over medium heat until the sugar dissolves. And then the heat is cranked up. The water will evaporate and the sugar will cook. And at that point, you get to the 300-degree range and even higher, and it caramelizes. But it's less risky because you have that water as a buffer between the sugar and the heat. So I would actually prefer you starting with the wet method if you want to. I mean, if you're a really, really, crazy person and you want to try the dry method, go ahead. But again, start with the wet. Go, work your way up if you're interested, but the wet method works beautifully. So the next thing I want to do before I give you this fabulous recipe is I want to talk about after you heat sugar and water and maybe that little bit of acid and you get caramelization and you get the mixture will turn almost like brewed tea, lightly brewed tea. You'll take it off the heat. And then this is where you want to stop the caramelization process. And caramelization at that high temperature doesn't want to stop. I mean, it just keeps on going. So you have to really put your foot down and you have to stop this thing. And there is some carryover cooking, so you have to be super careful. So the longer you cook sugar, the more complex the flavor will become. And then you'll hit this point where it gets bitter and burnt. And you don't want to get to that point. So you want to stop the cooking process before you reach that point. Some chefs like to use a thermometer to actually measure the temperature. And I have found that by the time you put the thermometer in and see if you've reached caramelization, and by the time you take the thermometer out, you're burnt, the sugar's gone, and all you have is a burned on caramelized pot. So I don't recommend that. I actually recommend the color test. Look at the color. Use your senses, use your eyes. So I found it better to observe the color of the caramel and stop the cooking process before it gets too dark. So if the recipe says you want to cook it till it's the color of, let's say, brewed tea, maybe and 3 or 4 dunks of that tea bag in a cup of water, and that color, that can be very dark. Do it so that it looks like lightly brewed tea. And then take it off the heat and it will darken. Even as you take it off the heat, it will continue that carryover cooking. So it can continue on and burn. I've even burnt it just by taking it off the burner for 2 seconds before I've put in other ingredients. It can still burn. So make sure it's not too dark. So around 300 to 320, again, you're going by eye. You're just looking at color. You'll take it off the heat. And most recipes will stop this caramelization process by adding an ingredient. It's usually heavy cream. It can be other things, but you will whisk in heavy cream into that caramel. Although other liquids can be used. I've used such things as brewed coffee, which is yummy, flavored teas or fruit juices if you want to flavor your caramel, and even alcohol. I once made a fabulous bourbon caramel sauce. And of course, you want to take that off the heat so you don't ignite the pot. You can even add liqueurs even after the cooking process has stopped. So when you stop the cooking process with caramelization, it can be a bit dramatic. And I mean dramatic. This is not something you want a small child to do. You want to be there the whole time from the beginning to the end. When you make caramel, you don't walk away. You don't take a phone call. You don't even answer the door. Nothing. You don't take the dog out to be walked. All right. This is something that will demand your full attention or you can burn your house down. And I'm not kidding. When you initially put the cream or whatever liquid in to your caramel, it will sputter, and it will sputter very dramatically. I mean, it can look scary. So of course, you're going to take it off the heat. When you do this, you're going to pour it down the sides of the pan very slowly, and then you're going to whisk it. Sometimes you will have some lumps of caramel and hardened sugar because the cream was not 300 degrees when you put it in. Sometimes you can warm up your cream so it's not as dramatic, but it will still sputter, sort of like a child having a temper tantrum. But hang tough, it will calm down. Just keep whisking. And sometimes you have to put it back on the heat to whisk it and get all those lumps out. And they will melt down. Just give it some time to melt down. And then at this point, sometimes butter is added, a tablespoon or 2 of butter to enrich it. And again, sometimes other flavoring ingredients. I've even put melted chocolate in at that point, and you have like a chocolate caramel sauce, which is fabulous as well. So there's a lot of different ways that you can add different ingredients and get a fabulous flavored caramel sauce as well. Now, when you're using your pan, and you have this heavy bottom saucepan, it should be larger than what you think you might need. So you're only putting in a cup of sugar, let's say, and a half a cup of water. You can use your tiny little saucepan. No, use your medium-sized. Because again, once it starts bubbling up, it's volcanic bubbles and really hot. So I would recommend you use a saucepan that's sort of, double the size of what you would actually need. It doesn't have to be gargantuan pan, just bigger than you actually would need. You want to stir the sugar or sugars if there is corn syrup in addition to your granulated sugar, depending on your recipe. You want to stir your sugars and your water well. And then once the heat starts going and your sugar will melt, you'll see that you won't be able to see the granules anymore through the water. You want to stop stirring. All right, stop stirring. This is very, very important. So once the sugar has dissolved, take your spoon out and put it away. Don't use it again. Then I like to get a pastry brush. If you don't have a pastry brush, it's a really good thing to have. Take the pastry brush and a little cup of water and brush down the sides of the inside of the pan to dissolve any sugar crystals that might have formed. Because this can cause what's known as a seeding reaction. So you can actually start crystals forming on the sides of the pan. And if you have too many crystals forming and you've stirred too much, the crystals can actually start a crystallization reaction throughout your caramel. And it's just one block of crystal, and you don't want that. So use that pastry brush to actually dissolve those crystals of sugar, and they will appear as you stir. It just happens. You want to heat the ingredients gradually until they are dissolved. Don't put the heat on high right away. I found that the first thing that's going to evaporate is your water, right? Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius. So the water's going to boil off first, and it can actually cause the whole thing to boil over on your stove. And that's not fun to clean up, let me tell you. So you want to make sure the heat goes up gradually. Put it on medium heat first. Once you see all the waters evaporate, and you'll see sort of a puff of steam coming off. And then once that steam dissipates, you can put your heat up a little bit higher. Watch the caramel closely. Again, we're taking the color test, right? You want to observe it. It can burn quickly and easily. The other thing I like to do is keep a small bowl of ice water nearby in case something spatters, or your finger or hand is nearby and you get a spatter of caramel on your hand. You cannot just brush that off like a drop of boiling water, which hurts as it is. Caramel sticks. It will stick to your skin and it will burn you. I think I do have a scar on my left wrist from a caramel incident many years ago. And as you whisk in the cream to stop this cooking process initially, or whatever liquid you do get into it, again, take the pan off the heat, slide it off the heat to decrease that boiling up of the caramel. And then put it back on a lower temperature to whisk all the hardened pieces of caramel that may have formed. All right. So that is how you work with caramel. And I want to give you an easy recipe for a caramel sauce that you will really want to keep around. This caramel sauce makes about 1 cup, and it takes 1 cup of granulated sugar, half a cup of water, 1 teaspoon of lemon juice, and you're going to put those 3 things into a heavy bottom saucepan, medium sized. You're going to stir to combine them, and then you're going to put the heat up to about medium heat, medium high, stirring occasionally, like I said before, until the sugar's dissolved, and then put the spoon away. Then you're going to raise the heat and continue to cook it, brushing down with a pastry brush dipped in water if you see any crystals. And you want the sugar to come to a boil, the syrup come to a boil. Allow that syrup to boil and gently swirl the pan, only gently. If you swirl too heavily, sometimes you can cause another seeding reaction and crystallization to occur. So very gently swirl the pan, and then the mixture will become the color of light to medium brewed tea. And we talked about that color. Don't let it go too far. Remove the pan from the heat and carefully pour in 3/4 of a cup of heavy cream. The caramel will bubble up, so expect it. Just know you're going to see a little bit of a temper tantrum with your caramel. So use some caution. Do it slowly. Doesn't have to be dumped in all at once. And then I like to add 1 teaspoon of pure vanilla extract as well. And then I whisk my caramel over low heat until everything sort of melts down and gets smooth. And this caramel looks very thin in the beginning. Don't get upset. It is caramel. As it cools, it will thicken. You're not going to eat it when it's boiling hot. So you do need it to let it get to sort of a warm temperature if you want to serve it warm over a bread pudding or over ice cream, or let it cool down until it's room temperature. And what's great about caramel sauce, you can actually store it in the refrigerator in an airtight container for up to 3 weeks. And I take a little bit out if I want a little caramel sauce on something, or I want to serve it to guests for a dessert. You can microwave it to warm it up, and it will thin out a little bit. Don't add anything to it to thin it out. It will just, as you warm it, it will thin it out. It's spectacular. Now, before I leave you, I have to tell you that the pan, after you are done with your caramel, may be a little nasty looking, and you will have some cooked caramel on that pot. What do you do? So I'm not going to leave you hanging. I'm going to help you out here. Once you've emptied the pan of caramel, I want you to fill that pan with hot water. Okay, that saucepan with hot water, and any whisk or spoon that you might have that has some hardened sugar or caramel on it, put it right in the pan. As long as, obviously, it's got to be heat proof because you used it over the heat. Put it on the stove and bring that water in that saucepan up to a boil and let it sit. Take it off the heat once it boils, let it sit. And that caramel will melt down off the sides and bottom, and then you can easily clean it. See, I didn't leave you hanging. I told you I'd give you a tip on how to clean that pot because it can be a little scary to see that pot afterwards. But don't let that be a deterrent in making a spectacular caramel sauce. It's better than anything you can buy. So if you've enjoyed today's episode, hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to leave a review, I would greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions, head on over to bakingradio.com and leave me a message. I would love to answer some of your questions on air. And next time, we're going to be talking about frozen desserts.